Look, while you're in the stores doing your damnedest to buy Canadian, the top advertisers in this country are spending 70% of all Canadian advertising budgets on American social media platforms. Yeah, it's 100% true, and a very un-Canadian thing to do. Who are these companies that have lost their Canadian way? Well, they're your bank, your mobile provider, your automaker, your favorite retailer, and they need to hear from you today. Tell them to be more balanced in their approach to advertising. Explain that allocating more of their money to Canadian local television, local print, and local radio will help them reach more of us. Media grown by Canadian companies is food for Canadians. Without it, we die. Demand of our corporations that they stop cozying up to America and bring their advertising dollars home to Canada.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, theZoomer, hosted by Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to theZoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. Every hour, millions of words are written and spoken about the U.S. threat of tariffs. What's less discussed is the validity of Trump's demands, Canada's willingness to cede to them, and the impact of a buy Canadian mindset, if it endures, especially in advertising. So on today's show, we ask, what can practically be done to mitigate the impact of Trump's threatened tariffs? Joining us for that discussion are newspaper publisher, author, columnist, and historian Conrad Black, National Post editor-at-large Diane Francis, President and CEO of Post Media, Andrew McLeod, and here in studio with me, Chief Digital Officer of Zoomer Media, Dustin Titus. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start with this whole Buy Canadian push because there's a real movement happening right now. But I do think that when a lot of people think Buy Canadian, Andrew, they think cars, oil, food, and they don't think media. So make the case for us why it is so important we not ignore media as part of this conversation, as part of this movement.
Certainly. First, pleasure to be here. Privileged to be on a panel with two of our most accomplished and certainly famous contributors, Diane Francis and Conrad Black. I guess I would look at it in two ways, certainly from a news media perspective. First is just, I think everyone understands that news media is a core tenet and foundational to a functioning democracy. And, we've seen such terrible erosion of news media, not just in Canada, but right around the world. And that's largely a function of the fact that so much of the money has left domestic news media platforms, whether it's in Canada, the US, Europe, and it's moved to these social media platforms. So first, it is the impact to democracy. And when information and news is propagating through social media platforms via algorithms, they tend to bring out the more atavistic elements of our nature. And that's not good for society, and it's certainly not good for democracy. So that would be my first point. The second point is purely through an economic lens. We're in a very different era now, and certainly this has been brewing for some time. And I think it's reaching a culmination with the Trump presidency in the U.S. I think Canada and certainly multiple jurisdictions around the world need to understand that we're in a fight for capital. We're in a fight for our domestic economies. And I think a big part of that is starting with just, eating our own dog food within our own country. And so supporting domestic industries with dollars is critical. And it's going to be a foundational element of us ensuring that we've got economic stability. And so from an economic nationalism perspective, I think it's so important that Canadians and Canadian businesses support Canadian industries. And that certainly includes media.
In the absence of legacy media, Diane, you are left with social media, as Andrew says, or the CBC. Now, Moses reminded me the line, a Karl Marx line about a capitalist being the one who sells you the rope to hang him. You've made a living in Canadian media. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that very important point is being raised here by Moses. You know, it's not just going to, I applaud consumers who want to make their position known and boycott American stuff. Not easily done because of the integration. I think the advertising agencies, most of whom are American owned, should also be told that, you know, they should direct as much of the advertising by advertising companies to Canadian media instead of to the American digital guys, wherever that's possible. The other thing I wanted to raise are the hidden things we can't do much about, but this is one of the big problems. And, you know, I wrote a book in 2013 about this, about Canada's growing dependence on the United States and its failure to protect its borders or its Arctic or its military. But, you know, every day, I think 4 million barrels of oil are produced in Alberta, and all but 1 million of it goes to the United States, and none of it is going across the country directly to Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. So we are importing 1.5 million barrels a day from foreigners and have done for 1 million years when we need, because we are capable of being self-sufficient. And Prime Minister Stephen Harper tried to get the Energy East pipeline, but Quebec, of course, sabotaged it. So we've robbed ourselves of our own ability to be independent and to not have to be dependent on the United States.
There really are endless examples of Canada shooting itself in the foot, and that being one of them. But Conrad, just going back to this discussion about the state of Canadian media, as someone who's been in the trenches of media for decades, how would you describe where we're at right now?
I would be cautious, Marissa, about requiring that, even morally requiring that people advertise in Canadian media. All of us here, Andrew certainly, knows that the media buy is essentially a straight commercial one. It's cost per thousand in the newspaper business, and you go where you're going to get the audience, and you accept the pricing in advertising that gives you the most exposure for the least expenditure. And I don't think we can defy that. Now, with that said, I do agree that it would be a good thing as part of a comprehensive plan of Canadianization for people to emphasize trying to buy in Canada unless they simply can't justify it in terms of quality or cost. But what we need, and both of the preceding speakers have said this, is better government. We need policies that encourage economic growth, encourage investment. We've had a net deficit of investment, more money leaving this country that was generated in this country than money invested in it from outside for the last 10 years, totaling over $300 billion. And that's just bad public policy. It's a fabulous country. It's a treasure house. Everything, all base metals, precious metals, forms of energy, forest products, agriculture, except for tropical fruit. Everything is here to attract people. We just have to give them the tax and regulation regime that is competitive. And we haven't been doing it. Now, that's where you start, I think. And the specific area of advertising, I think we have to actually have the media buy argument on our advertising to do it. But that can be done. And I am in that endangered species that is in favor of greater expenses in public broadcasting as long as we get better quality for it. I mean, I have, believe it or not, some friends in the CBC. It's not a network that's dealt particularly gently with me over the years, but they can't watch the CBC News anymore because it is full of anti-Canadian propaganda that isn't news and isn't accurate. It's three hanky tearjerker stories about minority groups being discriminated, all as part of this vast, horrible inheritance that we have of mistreatment of natives, which is hideously overstated. I think you start by attracting investment, encouraging economic growth, and definitely encouraging Canadians to buy Canadian, and it'll all come. I mean, I'd go this far. I think Canadians would make some sacrifice to support Canadian, their fellow Canadians in different activities, if they thought it was part of a serious plan to strengthen this country.
As an experienced media manager and buyer, how do you respond to Conrad's point?
I mean, ultimately, CMOs are trying to get closer to the bottom line, right? They need to equate one ad dollar to one sale. And in a challenging economy like we're dealing with, it's going to continue to happen that way. I think that what we're seeing is in an opportunity to continue to buy Canadian media is at a fire sale, and it still is super effective and reaches the majority of Canadians. Mm-hmm. I think we can still continue to buy Canadian, and I think we have to focus on supporting the value chain and making sure that we can show CMOs that our meat is just as valuable as anything we can buy south of the border.
At the same time, you have Bill C-18, Andrew, and you were a principal pressure in the creation of Bill C-18 and a reflection of the fact that you were hurting at the time. It was supposed to be a win for Canadian media because it was intended to pressure Google and Meta to pay for Canadian content. Now, ultimately, that backfired when Meta pulled Canadian content from their platform. First of all, what happened there, and how did it affect your business?
Well, first of all, I would reject the assertion that it backfired by having Meta back out. I think a critically important point that needs to be, really well understood by all Canadians and certainly your viewers is that, we're up against unfair competition. I think people lose sight of that at times. There are a number of antitrust suits that are working their way through the court system in the US that explicitly state that Google is acting as a monopolist. They've actually had one verdict that explicitly states that they, in fact, have been found guilty of acting like a monopoly. And so we're not dealing with an efficient market. We're dealing with an apex predator that simultaneously creates the most audience, but also controls all the infrastructure for how that audience is monetized. That's not fair competition. And, you asked a question around C-18. C-18, from my perspective, was simply a stopgap. The real solution here is that, and ultimately it has to come from either the US or the EU. It's unwinding or unpacking the dominance of Google's position relative to the advertising infrastructure and the technology and the trading platforms that allow them to compete unfairly. And so C-18 was really an attempt to put a stopgap or take a Tylenol for a headache without actually addressing the root cause. And, there has been some success. Google has remitted $100 million to Canada, and now it's in the process of being dispersed to various media outlets. Yes, Meta did exit the country. My view is simply, I would rather have Meta exit the country and have domestic media companies relearn how to reach their own audience, rather than being in an environment where they are fundamentally subservient to a Meta platform and an algorithm where they might get pennies on the dollar.
But in the immediate,
I'll finish
Andrew,
with one last thought.
Okay.
I think it's super important. Domestic media doesn't have an audience problem. We have record audiences across the country. What we have is a difficulty or a challenge in monetizing that audience fairly. That's true in Canada, the United States, and right around the world. That's the core issue that has to be addressed.
But did you not see a loss of business in your digital division when Meta pulled Canadian content?
Absolutely not. We saw a little bit of a downturn in audience for about 3 months, and then that audience returned. It came back to us because people relearned how to find the content. People, in some cases, when their primary interface or mechanism for getting information was Facebook, certainly then those people, it took some time for them to find their way back to the content. What we've found is that there is a intrinsic need or an almost insatiable desire on the part of the public to get original, authentic information and an opinion from people like Diane and Conrad, and they will find their way back to that. And what really needs to occur is we have to find a way to get a fair return from the audience we create digitally and make a real dollar, an ROI on that audience that we create. And right now that's extremely difficult due to the dominance of the foreign platforms, which, as I've said and will continue to repeat, are acting as monopolists. And I think the courts will adjudicate that very soon.
Dustin?
I mean, it's interesting. It depends on, I think, the type of business that we're dealing with. At Zoomer, we definitely had a large audience on social media, and we experienced maybe about a 25 to 30% decline in revenue. We're starting to figure out ways to get around it, to Andrew's point. But there's no question that hurt us in the short term, and is incapacitating our ability to tell certain stories to our community more effectively because we don't have that venue anymore.
Another manifestation of the deep hypocrisy of this all, Diane, is the fact that the Liberal government stopped advertising with Meta when this happened, but have since changed course, even though Meta hasn't started carrying Canadian content again, and since the beginning of this year have spent $100,000 with Meta.
Yes, and this is the same government, too, to just go deeper into the background of this C-118. I'm a big fan of another country called Australia. Canada should be like Australia. Canada fails on every metric compared to Australia. And this is what they did. They did a few years ago. They had a tangle with Facebook and they said, look, you are plagiarizing content and selling ads around it for your own benefit. So, you either cut them in on the pie or you pay them for their content. That's intellectual property. They had a big dust up. And what happened as a result of that was Facebook did a deal with Australia. And now local media, local broadcasters are, flush with cash. Everything is very fair, and it all worked out well. So our inept government in Ottawa dispatched whoever had that cabinet position to pull off the same thing that Australia did. And guess what? For what reason, nobody knows. Nobody knows. But now, he was asking for too much or giving too much of a hassle about this or that. And Facebook just said, we can't deal with you guys. You're incompetent. So we don't have a deal. Australia has a deal. We don't have a deal because we have a Trudeau government.
Conrad, obviously Trump's not happy with it. He'd like to see the removal of C-18 and that digital services tax. You have to wonder if all this talk about tariffs is just a way of softening us up for the renegotiation of USMCA. What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, I think that's substantially true. I just want to say a word at the outset about what some of the others have said. I myself don't see the departure of Meta as any great, terrible deprivation of the Canadian public. With what Andrew said, I have to say, Andrew, with the best will in the world, I would not place my bets on the ability of the American justice system to do anything right. It is an awful system, and it's a profoundly dishonest system, as the president has experienced himself and often said. I'm in the same corner with you. I just can't share your optimism that that's going to be the source of our deliverance. As to what you said, Marissa, that's Trump's technique, especially when he has the apparent upper hand, to start by pounding the table or overturning the table or, threatening frightful things. But then he gets down to business. And I think we're now already in the phase where the negotiations are going on. And as we all know, trade negotiations are horribly complicated. You've got to be a trade wonk. You're trading, vanadization of some types of metal for coatings on shingles and things. And you really have to know the details of it to get anywhere. And I find it reassuring that everyone seems to agree that our trade negotiators are very good. But that's what we're going. We're not going to have a 25% tariff. He negotiates the way he does. But he's basically moved on to other things anyway. He leaves that to officials.
Raise your glass, Canada. So far, so good. But still, so far to go. You see, buying Canadian is a movement that may have started in grocery stores, but it's about more than where your fruit comes from. Buying Canadian also means Canadian media, local media. Imagine if every Canadian business spent its Canadian advertising budget on local media, reaching 40 million of us who want to do the Canadian thing by consuming your Canadian-made goods. You could start by advertising on the station you're listening to right now. Do you want to know who else is listening? Your Canadian customers. Advertise on Canadian local media. I mean, what's good for the country can also be good for business. Oh, and if you're wondering about the beer, yes, it is.
Andrew, let me come back to you on this. What do you say to the argument that Google and Meta are the only way to reach Canadians? That advertising on Google and Meta is the only way to reach Canadians?
I would say it's ridiculous. They produce audience, we produce audience. I think, domestic media companies, whether it's a broadcaster, whether that is a digital publisher, whether it's radio, we reach vast Canadian audiences, millions and millions of people. I could speak specifically to Post Media, coast to coast. And it's excellent audience. And the contextualization of the information along with the trusted brands. You look at the Montreal Gazette, hundreds and hundreds of years of trust and integrity woven into the very fabric of Montreal, Quebec, and Canada. And I could go on and on, the Kingston Whig. There's so many titles within our purview, and that matters. That makes a difference to Canadians. So I don't buy into the argument that somehow it's inherently better. I think they've done a good job creating massive reach, of removing friction. You can deploy tens of millions of dollars with 5 or 6 clicks on their platform. And they do a good job of serving up data sets that show you that you're reaching your audience. But I don't think it's inherently better. And I think our industry, the domestic media industry, is starting to create a lot of the same outcomes, a lot of the same first-party data, a lot of the same targeting, and removing the inefficiencies associated with buying domestic. And I feel very good about our future. And I think that we will regain our footing.
Because the quickest way, Dustin, to dismiss the Canadian position is to say you cannot achieve those same objectives except by buying American media because all of Canada is on it. So how would you do it then?
Yeah, I think Meta is just a part of the entire sales funnel, and it operates really well at the bottom of the funnel. And we can buy TV, we can buy print, we can buy radio, and then we can layer in digital pubs, and then we can kind of layer in, Facebook and Meta at the bottom of the funnel. One of the problems that we're seeing in general from Canadian advertisers today is that they've dried up the top of their funnel, right? They're not buying the awareness-based advertising. They're buying too much Google search or too much Meta in feed, and they don't have the traffic they need or to warm up the audience to make a purchasing decision. Being able to make a sale at the bottom is what needs to happen at the end of the day.
And radio, at the end of the day, is one of the best ways to reach Canadians, is it not? We all remember the great outage.
Absolutely.
When Rogers went dark.
Absolutely. Still the number one way to reach Canadians. I was in the West Kelowna wildfires 2 years ago, and radio was the number one way for us to get news. At Facebook, we couldn't do anything with. So it's still a fantastic place to buy, and one of the places that has the best reach in the country, for sure.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, but stick around. When we come back, what to expect with Trump's latest tariff threat. That's next. Welcome back. So just a month after threatening it, President Trump has pushed back on his decision on tariffs for Canada again, now to April 2nd. So what's the deal? Is this really happening or just another negotiating tactic? Diane, because many economists have said that any protracted trade war with Canada and the U.S., Canada would lose. So what do you think? Is this another negotiating tactic? Is he bluffing?
Oh, sure. He's getting more concessions out of us. He obviously got very quick response in the form of, Canada appointed a fentanyl czar to guard the border, to prevent fentanyl from getting through Canada into the United States, and promised drones and some other security measures, and that got us the first, postponement. Now we're getting a second postponement because there's going to be some other concessions that are being discussed. Could be specific commodities. I've got to believe that the car industry is screaming up and down. I'm starting to see finally articles in the New York Times and other American newspapers about the effects of his tariffs on the state of Michigan and Ohio. All of the automobile alley, which incorporates 7 states, and most of them vote his party. So he's getting pushback and screaming from the auto workers and the suppliers in those states, because the automobile industry is American owned and very integrated. And so, that's the kind of thing he's going to start to do some concessions. And I think eventually most of it will melt away, but I leave it to others to speculate.
Well, in all these discussions, Conrad, lurking in the background is all that we do with Quebec. One of the biggest irritants for Americans is our supply management system, especially when it comes to dairy and eggs. So how much of that is a factor in this trade tension in these discussions?
Well, Trump himself has mentioned that, in effect, they're colossal protective arrangements. And indeed, the Canadian consumer is the chief victim of them. I think there are better ways of achieving the ends that these agricultural protective measures are aiming at. If that's what we want, I think we should just directly subsidize some of the farmers and let the consumers get the benefit of a lower cost. And at the same time, it gives us a much stronger argument in trade negotiations. I think, I want to be clear, I'll wave the flag around, maple leaf flag around as much as anybody, and I'm proud to do it. It's a great country, but we've simply got to play a better game than we have. Trump, in a way, is doing us a favor if we actually take some of these points seriously and act on what you just said, Marissa. We shouldn't have these internal barriers between the provinces. And what Diane said at the outset is absolutely true. There is absolutely no grounds whatsoever for a province to stop a pipeline. We just have to get on with it. It's an eminent domain of the federal government. We've got to assert it. And by the way, the oil we ship to the United States, since it's now basically an oil-sufficient country, they sell on at a profit. We don't even sell it at the market price. We're chumps. We're importing oil when we're an oil self-sufficient country. And the oil we do sell, because we can't get the pipelines to the ocean shore, is then sold on by the Americans at a profit. We're just getting skimmed everywhere. And we just have to play a better game, including in the private sector.
Andrew, we've been talking about interprovincial trade barriers for as long as Confederation has been here, and everybody says they're crazy, they're stupid, they cost a fortune, they keep us down. So what is your understanding of whether we can actually get this done?
Well, look, I wouldn't sit here and suggest that I have any expertise on interprovincial trade and what would be required, but I would just look at it through a leadership lens. I think that we've been complacent for far too long. We have the great luxury of living next to the world's greatest economy and the world's greatest military power, and that's made us complacent. And, Trump is creating an external stressor to this country. And I think in the long run, it will be beneficial for us. We need to control what we can control. We need to be self-sufficient. We need to utilize our own energy. We need to remove provincial trade barriers. We need to create optionality. So as Conrad said, we're not selling our energy at a deep discount to one customer. And I think that Canada has such an incredible wealth and abundance of resources, ingenuity, and opportunity. We just need better leadership. We need competent leadership. We need to get our act together, and we need to start taking our own destiny in our hands and stop reacting at every step to what the U.S. president is saying and doing.
Well, Canada has said it would retaliate with its own set of tariffs, Diane, but no matter how you slice it, is Canada's position like being the small guy in a tug of war?
Great it is. That's why, we should have been doing a lot of things, which I recommended in my book in 2013, such as stopping the flow of attention north-south and making it east-west. And that would include building pipelines east-west and getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers east-west, and then develop a more muscular economy, which would make us less dependent on the U.S. Now we are, pretty darn dependent on the United States. So he will get concessions out of this government. We'll see by April 2nd what we've given up, or if we haven't, I think we're going to get slammed.
Last we spoke, Conrad, you said Trump would not pull the trigger on tariffs, and you were right then. What do you think now?
Yeah. This is. I'm going on intuition here. Don't anyone get the idea that I have any inside information. I do not. But he's just negotiating. I don't think we'll get there. I want to sound one note, though. I think our position is not quite so pathetically inadequate in such a thing as Diane says. We could do a lot of things that would be quite damaging to the Americans. And Andrew, I imagine, knows that I wrote for his paper the other day that amongst the things we should do is suggest how welcome the American northern states would be to join Canada. Why not? Two can play that game. Obviously, historically, Mr. Lincoln resolved that point. The secession is not something that the Americans smile upon, but it's worth saying it. Florida was mentioned. We could dollarize a couple of those Caribbean islands, subsidize and invest in their resort industry, which is basically the only industries they have, and incentivize a huge movement of Canadians there as opposed to Florida. There are all kinds of things we could do that would be terribly exasperating to the Americans. So if they actually want to make a real severe economic argument out of this, which they don't, by the way. We won't just roll over. We'll be if we play our cards right, the equivalent of, in military terms, what Finland did with the USSR in 1939. I mean, we could give the US a bloody nose. Now, none of us want to think in these terms, and neither do the Americans. It is absurd to contemplate a trade war like this, and it's not going to happen, and Trump is not going to initiate it. He just felt that all he wants is for the United States not to have its pocket picked by anybody, friend or foe. Apart from that, he is an advocate of the theory that I believe first enunciated by Lord Palmerston, that nations have interests, they don't have friends. And he just wants to make sure that while he is the head of the United States, no one is picking America's pocket. Well, we're not aspiring to do that. We're the fact that we're slackers and loafers and have these ridiculous internal barriers is not because we're trying to cheat the Americans. It's just we haven't governed ourselves very well. And it's up to us to cure that. But may I say one other thing? The initial argument put up for this about admitting too many undesirables from Canada into the U.S. and too much fentanyl is complete nonsense, and everybody knows it. I mean, the country that is complaining about what is coming into it is the country that maintains its border. We're not East Germany. We don't put up a wall to keep people in this country. If the Americans think there's too much personnel they don't want or substances they don't want coming from Canada to the U.S., it's up to them to stop it. And Trump's big complaint with his predecessor was what went on in Mexico, where over 10 million people just poured in without officials even taking their names, and many of them, clearly tens of thousands of them, dangerous criminals. Well, that's really America's fault. So, I mean, this whole thing has become a kind of sloganeering contest when what we're really getting is a trade negotiation.
And America needs to curb its appetite for fentanyl. But let me end on this, and I'll bring it full circle, Andrew. How would you characterize this moment for Canada, especially with this Buy Canada push?
I honestly, I think Canada and many other jurisdictions in the world are at an inflection point. You're seeing a change in the status quo right around the world, whether it's Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, certainly Canada, the United States. And I think that the tectonic plates are shifting, and it's not clear yet what the new construct will be. We had a period of 75 or 80 years post World War II, where there was one sort of stable hegemony, and that's now dissipating. And it's not clear what it will be on the other side of it. From a Canadian perspective, I think we're really at an inflection point. We're very focused on tariffs because that's an immediate sword of Damocles hanging over us. But I think more fundamentally, Trump is aggressively deregulating. Trump is stating that he's going to lower the corporate tax rate. Trump is a world-class attractor of capital. Trump, in term one, made the economy roar, and he was shackled in many regards. Trump is not shackled in his second term. And I think Canada needs to wake up to the fact that we can no longer be complacent, and we need to get our house in order. We need to create our own destiny. And I echo the points that Diane and Conrad have made. We have every opportunity in front of us to be successful, but we need strong leadership, competent leadership, and we need to get our act together and start finding ways to win.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. On the other side, final thoughts from our panelists. Don't go away. Welcome back to theZoomer. We'll get some final thoughts from our panelists now. Conrad, why don't you start us off?
I agree with those who have said that this is an opportunity for us. The fact is, if we respond properly, we could kind of kickstart a new phase in the development of the country. To me, the most disturbing fact of all is that, I mean, I'm doubtless the oldest person in this group, but I'm not that ancient. When I was young, it was between Australia and Canada as to which was the second most prosperous country in the world per capita after the US, leaving out petro states and tax haven states. We're not talking about, Monaco or Liechtenstein or something. We're talking about real economies. And we're now 50% behind the US. I mean, they're 150% of our, comparing oranges and oranges, of our per capita income. There's no excuse for this. It's a very rich country. It doesn't have the legacy of slavery. Even if we pulled our weight militarily, we only have to go up to 2% of GDP, not where the Americans are, with their colossal military establishment. And we're just underachieving. And that's our fault and no one else's. And if this is helping us see that, if Trump is kind of angering us, provoking us into seeing our own limitations, even if we swaddle it in, the usual anti-American, anti-Trump rhetoric you get in the media of this country, and conversationally, he's doing us a favor. Not that he particularly wants to; he'd be happy to, but that's not his purpose. He's not paid to do us favors, and indeed, he doesn't accept his paycheck anyway. But if that's what's happening, let's take advantage of it. And we can. It's a great country, and we can make it a lot greater very quickly with a bit of leadership, as I think all of us have said in one way and another.
Diane?
I agree wholeheartedly. We've had a shockingly mediocre federal liberal government since Trudeau took power, with 32% of popular vote, but a system that allowed him to stay in power with a socialist. And now we have, virtually a Green Party and a Socialist Party that have driving us toward the ditch. High taxes, too many entitlements, a flood of immigrants that are unscreened and unpurposed, that have driven up housing prices, and that have, overwhelmed the healthcare system. No attention paid to the economic realities and how you do have to be careful with your immigration policy as well as all the other things you do. So I think it's tragic that we've been in the grip. And I think, as Conrad said, Canadians are just as talented. We have more resources than many more resources, and we could exploit them in an ethical way, which is what we've always done. And end up not only surpassing Australia, but maybe lapping the United States in incomes. And that's not a dirty word. It's important to give your people a nice way of living. And Trudeau has been an abysmal failure.
Andrew?
I would just emphasize that it's certainly been in the media sector, it's been a very difficult decade. And I think from a Canadian perspective, we've lost a lot of ground. But I am an optimist. I believe that things will get better. I think there's a huge opportunity in front of this country. And I think that's been very well articulated by Diane and Conrad. And I think purely from a media lens, I feel like, it's a little too early to say that we're coming out of the woods, but there are some cautious signals of some green shoots. And I think that there are better days ahead for not just the domestic media sector, but hopefully for many different sectors of this economy, and we can regain our footing. And I'm a very proud, patriotic Canadian, and I believe that we will get back to where we were. And I'm excited for that journey.
The Canadian identity is in trouble. I think we need local media and media representation more than we ever have. We need to tell the Canadian story and to keep supporting Canadian business and Canadian communities. And it's important for advertisers to work with us to get that access that they need and the results that they're looking for. Bill C-18 hasn't worked. It's absolute garbage, and having the government interject into a market that they have no business being in is something that shouldn't have happened to begin with. While I appreciate the effort, if the effort had worked, I'd probably appreciate a little bit more. But we're talking about pennies in the bucket instead of what the bucket should look like, which is substantially a lot more money going to Canadian publishers. So, I think C-18 needs to go away and get the government out of a market like this for sure.
All right, and bottom line, if we're serious about supporting Canada, Buy Canadian needs to include our media. We got to keep jobs here and protect our voice. Thanks to everyone for tuning into my panel for this very powerful discussion. To get in touch, you can send us an email at comments@thezoomer.com. We'll see you soon. For now, it's time to zoom out.